Yeah, it's good to hear you are having a good time doing that. But anyway, vaccine stuff,
Uh-huh.
as I always reach out to you for. So what I wanted to ask about today was booster shots, because it was just something I, wondered about when we were having a news meeting the other day, and we were sort of spitballing ideas. So right now there's just been so much coverage of the initial push, but it's like in the future, are we going to need boosters for this? How does that go?
It's a great question whether or not we're going to need booster shots. The way I would look at it is examining factors related to the pathogen and also factors related to the vaccine. So the pathogen, it's a virus. We know that. It's not a bacteria. It's not a parasite. Being a virus, it's an obligated intracellular organism. And there are two types of viruses. There are RNA viruses and there are DNA viruses. We know that the RNA virus, which this particular virus is, they tend to be less stable. So think of influenza. It's an RNA virus. It tends to mutate. In fact, every year we're challenged to address those mutations by developing a new vaccine. Uh, if we did not do that, the vaccine would quickly be old and no longer be able to recognize these new viral variants that result from these mutations. So with that background, this virus does mutate. We've seen that variants have emerged. For example, what was reported in the United Kingdom, another variant in South Africa, another variant in Japan from travelers coming from Brazil. Now, fortunately, those variants have not affected the spike protein. People may know that these vaccines that we're currently seeing emerge are targeting the spike protein that allows the virus to enter the human host cell. So if that remains stable, it's likely the vaccines will remain good and we can follow the current recommendations that do not require booster doses. But having said that, though, this virus will mutate, and we should keep track, very, very close vigilance on those mutations, and in particular, note whether they involve the spike protein, which may then, like influenza, require in the future booster doses. Now, the other issue that I mentioned has to do with the vaccine itself, and there are two types of vaccines. Simply put, they're the live attenuated vaccines, like the measles virus vaccine that we get. Those vaccines tend to prolong longer immunity. They tend to provide a stronger immune response than the other type of vaccines, which we call the inactivated vaccines. And not to get too complicated, but the inactivated vaccines, there's two types. There's the whole cell, like the injected polio vaccine we receive, and there are what are called subunit vaccines that represent proteins, small particles of the virus that stimulate our immune response. And these vaccines that we're currently looking at, that we're currently rolling out in the United States, are subunit vaccines. Now, that generalization that inactivated vaccines are probably less robust in the immune response compared to live, like with everything in biology, there are exceptions. You know, the hepatitis B vaccine is an exception. The vaccine against human papillomavirus that causes cervical cancer in women is an exception. And the reason they're exceptions are that the vaccine is a very simple, small protein that makes it easy for the body to recognize. But most subunit vaccines tend to be larger, more complicated, like the polysaccharide vaccines, and we don't get the same robust response. So the bottom line is that we're dealing with smaller vaccines, one, smaller subunit vaccines, one, and secondly, these are RNA vaccines. These are genetic vaccines that we have no experience, so it's hard to predict. But with that background and adding all those factors up, I would say that I would not be surprised if we needed booster doses. I'm sorry to go into that detail, but I think it's important to understand many of those factors to be able to maintain public trust, maintain the expectations that nothing is perfect in biology, in molecular biology, but what we have so far is excellent. And the mutations that I described, those variants that have emerged from the UK, South Africa, Japan, Brazil, so far there's nothing to suggest that they affect the current vaccine efficacy of the vaccines that we have. So that's great news.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, as time goes on, though, if it appears that, I know you said the proteins on the outside of the virus, is that going to be like sort of the pivot point where we might look at, okay, we need either a different, we need to adjust the vaccine, or we're going to need boosters, something along those lines?
Yes, the influenza analogy is an appropriate one.
So is it fair to say, and I guess I just didn't understand it like this, every year when we have, the new version of the flu vaccine for that flu season, is that essentially just a booster to, what we've had previously, or is it like a totally new vaccine?
It's a good question, and the terminology gets complicated. It's a modification of an existing vaccine that responds to the changing epidemiology of the pathogen.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a sense, it is a booster because we've had doses on a yearly basis before, and we need those doses boosted.
So how is it different from, like, I'm thinking back to, when you're in grade school and then you go into college, you need like your MMR booster, how is that different from, like, the flu vaccine that we get every year that is, is or is not a booster, so to speak?
So I mentioned the two issues, the issues related to the pathogen itself,
Mm-hmm.
the virus, an RNA virus,
Mm-hmm.
and to the vaccine, the types of vaccines. But there are also factors related to the host itself, the human being. And some human beings have different responses to vaccines, number one. And two, the immune response that we have against the pathogen may wane. And so if it wanes, that is another issue that would require a booster dose. And that's the example you cite in college.
Okay. So would that, I guess, well, I guess like you said, it probably just depends on, what we're trying to fight, like it would depend on where the virus is at. But are boosters, would it be like an adjusted vaccine, or would it just be the same vaccine we got to like sort of revamp our immune response?
It would be both. Again, the terminology gets more complicated, but in the case of measles, the vaccine is exactly the same. In the
Okay.
case of influenza, it's modified to a small degree in order to have a better impact against the emerging changes.
So which would be more likely if we were to need a booster with COVID? Would it be more likely that it would be a slightly adjusted vaccine similar to the flu? Or would it be more likely that we just get the exact same shot 5 years later?
It'd be more like the flu.
Okay, like we're going to have
vaccine, yes, the vaccine would have to be able to respond to the changes in the pathogen.
Okay.
And in the case of measles, the pathogen doesn't necessarily change to the extent that it requires a major change in the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
It's more related to the host, the patient themselves, and their ability to maintain a robust immune response.
Okay, interesting. So essentially this is, something just COVID-19, and you know, I mean, it's called COVID-19 because it was found in 2019, but we're in 2021 already. Um, so potentially we're going to need to be adjusting like how we vaccinate for this for a very long time, is what I'm understanding.
It's yes, you know me well enough that I don't like to predict because science is such that it's hard
Sure.
to predict.
But we're
But
already seeing these variants, and we're so early on in the grand scheme of how, you know, this could play out over decades.
yes, and as those variants emerge, they take different pathways. They can establish themselves as being major contributors to the epidemiology of the disease, or they can die out. And so it'll be impossible to predict which pathway they take. But it is possible, and the bottom line is that we're prepared for either pathway.
Hmm. Okay. Um, I mean, at this point, we're so, as a society, we're so used to the flu. Like the flu doesn't really shake us, you know, it doesn't freak us out like COVID-19 does. But you know, if COVID-19 just continues to, like you say, mutate, and you know, we have so many different variations of it after several years, could we get to a point where, you know, the coronavirus is just like a new form of the flu in the future? Or is it
Well, it's
not like that?
it's it's an
I
interesting
mean, you said that
question.
some of those strains could die out, but I mean, the flu certainly hasn't died out. We still deal with it every single year.
Yes, the flu is endemic, and this virus will likely remain endemic. You know, the SARS and the MERS viruses that are also coronaviruses, interestingly, they didn't become endemic. But the bottom line with this virus is it's more dangerous than flu. Flu is dangerous, but this one is more dangerous. We're seeing more than 3,000 people die a day in the United States, and that's just you know, that's sad but true.
Hmm. What has to happen for something to happen like what did with SARS and MERS, where it just kind of faded away after a little while? Like, how does a virus go that route versus just continuing to mutate and it's not giving up?
It's impossible to predict.
Yeah, okay. I know that's a big question, but I'm just curious. Okay, and then my next question was, you know, for people who have the antibodies, are they like lower priority, so to speak, to get this vaccine than people who have no immunity? You know, they haven't been exposed.
Interesting question. Very complicated when we think in terms of public health because you're not testing people before they get vaccinated. And so they may have antibodies, they may have had silent infection, but you're vaccinating them. But it would be way too costly, way too impractical to try to test everybody before we vaccinate. So if they fall in the group that is currently being prioritized, those people greater than 65 years of age, for example, particularly people greater than 65 years of age with comorbidities like heart disease, lung disease, and so on, diabetes, we're not going to check their antibody status before they get vaccinated. The public health response that will protect not only them, but the community will be one of a vaccine policy recommendation. The question whether or not they've had symptoms and they know they've been infected and whether or not they should be vaccinated, the current recommendation generally is to go ahead and vaccinate them because we don't know the duration of protection with this virus. We won't know for several years because it takes time to accumulate all that data to be able to conclude, make conclusions with certainty.
Okay. So, you know, I was chatting with a friend the other day, and she's kind of been, you know, do I want the vaccine? Do I not? Kind of like, you know, on the edge. She's very, you know, pro vaccine in general, but this one is kind of hitting her differently, which I don't think is uncommon for a lot of people, for whatever reason. But I don't know. It seemed like, you know, she's already had COVID-19. And that was kind of one more like box for her to check, so to speak, to be like, oh, well, I have the antibodies. In theory, I'm, at least close to immune or closer than I was before. So now I'm less inclined to get the vaccine than I was before. I would think it's fair to say that's not an uncommon thought process for a lot of people to go through right now, because people are kind of weighing their pros and cons at this point, because it is a tough choice for a lot of people. What would you say to folks who maybe use the fact of, oh, I've already had it, to justify not getting vaccinated?
Well, I think you're right. You're right. It's a complicated question. I cited what the current policy is to go ahead and vaccinate. There's no data to show that it puts them at greater risk for an adverse consequence, or it will provide additional immunity. The other question has to do with the personal situation. If there's someone in the household, for example, with an autoimmune disease, some other condition, that you would want to be more vigilant in protecting that person, an older person, for example, then I might ask them to reconsider and
Well, we
take.
do know people can get it more than once, because
Yeah,
at the same token, I have a friend who's had it twice. So,
yeah,
I don't know.
exactly. Yeah. So there's no harm in getting it twice. And the fact that you can get the infection twice, and the factors that I mentioned with regards to household risk and transmission, I think I would push more towards, definitely push more towards getting the vaccine.
Okay. Do we know about how immune someone is who does have the antibodies? Like, how much do you naturally build up immunity if you've already had COVID-19 and fought it off? Or is it hard? Is it different in everyone's body? I don't know.
Well, we have tests, and those tests are standardized. They're not perfect tests, though. There are some false negatives, for example.
Because I have the antibodies, so to speak, but I know it's not a perfect test. I've heard that before.
Yeah, yeah.
You could have fought off a different kind of coronavirus and still potentially show those antibodies, from what I understand. So I don't know, how likely is it that someone does have some immunity if they get antibody positive test results?
Well, you're in vaccinology, you're sort of bridging to an area that we call correlates of protection. If we know what exactly the biologic entity that would reflect with 100% certainty that you are protected, that's fantastic. Neutralizing antibodies are generally, in most cases, a good correlate of protection. But you're sort of bridging into a very complicated area. For a lot of vaccines, we do not know the correlate of protection for the individual. But when we monitor disease in the community and we see that disease comes down to lower levels and maybe even to zero as a result of your interventions, the masking, the social distancing, the vaccination, then things are working. And that's, in public health, what we want to see.
Okay. That's all my questions. Anything else, though, that you want to say?
No, I think we covered your questions, and you, as usual,